In 1937, a twice-divorced American married a former British sovereign in their country of exile, France. Edward VIII had abdicated the throne in order to marry the woman he loved, Wallis Simpson. Unknown a year earlier, Wallis was by now one of the most vilified women in the world, the American seductress who had led the unwitting king astray.
Wallis is a classic example of Eve, the woman who leads man to damnation through her sexual charms and powers.
She's been called a Nazi, a whore, a harlot, a prostitute, a gold-digging adventuress and a spy.
By society with a capital S, she was regarded as a cunning little schemer who wanted to be queen.
Even today, decades after her death, Wallis continues to provoke strong reactions. But how much does she deserve this reputation? Was she a victim of circumstance, blind to the situation in which she found herself? Or did she, like Icarus, fly too close to the sun and then drown in a sea of slander? Wallis Simpson was already 40 when she burst onto the world stage. She had stolen the heart of the world's most eligible bachelor. Wallis said herself, "I was no beauty, and he had the pick of the beautiful women of the world." But marriage to the former king came at a price. Her reputation was torn apart by malicious rumor and endless insult.
Pure evil. And that's the sort of attitude that has prevailed, and people don't necessarily know why they feel that way about Wallis, but they do.
Wallis is right up there in the pantheon with women who are blamed for men's defections and faults. Marie Antoinette, of course, was accused of bringing down the French aristocracy, and Wallis, in the same way, was accused of ending the reign of this king.
How necessary has it been to maintain the myth of Wallis as evil? Is it possible she was used to deflect attention away from a British conspiracy to oust King Edward VIII from the throne?
It's clear that Wallis was a godsend to the establishment who wanted to get rid of Edward. And so if Edward had had a relationship with Wallis as a kept woman, as a mistress, then she wouldn't have been any use at all as a way of bouncing him off the throne.
Though despised, Wallis's rise from obscurity to a place in history remains an endless source of fascination and speculation. But how did Wallis get here? Who was she really? Although destined to become one of the most well-known women in the world, Wallis had not been born to a life of privilege. An American, her parents were the poor relations within a family that, by contrast, included prominent members of 19th century Southern society. They lived in the fashionable district of Mount Vernon, within the burgeoning and vibrant city of Baltimore. Wallis's father, Teakle Wallis, was the youngest son of Henry and Anna Warfield. He suffered from tuberculosis and was dependent on his wealthy relatives for support. Wallis's mother, Alice Montague, was a descendant of one of Virginia's most distinguished families. The couple married in secret in November 1895.
Neither family had wanted the marriage because the Montagues thought that Alice, this beautiful, spirited young woman, could do rather better for herself. And the Warfields were terribly worried because Teakle Wallis was a consumptive.
In spring the following year, Wallis's parents left Baltimore and, in search of fresh air, moved to Square Cottage, located on the Blue Ridge summit in Monterey County. Wallis was born here on the 19th of June, 1896. At the end of the summer, the new family returned to Baltimore, renting a small apartment in the Brexton Residential Hotel. That November, just 4 days before his first wedding anniversary, Teakle died of tuberculosis, leaving his wife and daughter almost destitute. Alice was forced to accept an invitation and move with baby Wallis into the home of her mother-in-law on East Preston Street. Also resident in the house was Wallis's uncle Saul, a successful businessman.
He was the one on whom they depended, but although he paid them an allowance, it was never regular, and this was really cruelly controlling.
By the time Wallis was 12, mother and daughter had lived in 6 different places and seen their fortunes rise and fall, forever vulnerable to the munificence of Uncle Saul. Wallis's early years forged her desire for material security. But in early 20th century Baltimore, for a young woman without means, status and wealth were out of reach. Wallis, though, persuaded her uncle Saul to pay for her to attend Oldfields, a prestigious girls' school located to the north of Baltimore. She was 16.
Wallis decided very early on that she was going to find her fulfillment through a man. She decided that the easiest way for her to live a life of comfort and luxury was by finding a rich husband. And that was why she chose Oldfields. She actually wanted to move in the right circles where those sort of men were available to her.
School reports record that Wallis was a far from ideal student. She was described as a rebel, daring and aggressive, and an overactive flirt. Wallis was notorious for sneaking out of school to meet boys. And on leaving Oldfields, she wrote in the school yearbook not of her studies, but her life's purpose. All is love.
There's a wonderful story about when she was at Oldfields and she wanted to meet a boyfriend, and she jumped apparently from a first-floor balcony to go out for dinner with this boy who was waiting in the sports car down below, and Wallis decided which restaurant they'd go to. And of course the poor boy couldn't pay the bill, so the next day his father had to go and pay the bill at the restaurant.
Wallis was 18 when she left Oldfields. Having honed her man-charming skills, she set out on her career in marriage.
In Wallis's time, there was no other option. 3% of women went to college at all, so marriage was the only game in town, and the only route for women then to status, power, and security.
Opportunity came when, in April 1916, Wallis accepted an invitation to stay with a cousin at the Pensacola Naval Air Station in Florida. There, she met pioneering naval pilot Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr. He was 8 years older than Wallis and a man of the world. Wallis would describe Wynne as the world's most fascinating aviator.
He was handsome, devastatingly handsome. He looks like Errol Flynn. So you can see why she fell in love, but it was a whirlwind romance. She really didn't know him terribly well. And he put pressure on her. He gave her 6 months. I want you to marry me. Decide quickly. And she said yes.
At Christ Protestant Episcopal Church in Baltimore, Wally married an American naval officer, becoming Mrs. Earl Winfield Spencer.
It was November 1916. Wallis was 20. A year later, Wynne received orders to transfer to California to set up another naval air station near San Diego. He did a remarkable job.
200 Seahawks soar above the San Diego Naval Air Station in a spectacular sky review. Sweeping over the harbor en masse, they present a thrilling picture of Uncle Sam's air power, a stirring sight.
Away from work, however, the dashing pilot became abusive. His behavior fired by alcohol. Wallis was said to fear being alone with him.
She says that he packed a bottle of alcohol in the suitcase that he took on his honeymoon, and that he became violent soon after, and that the alcohol fueled his violence.
In 1921, the couple moved to Washington, D.C. By this time, Wallis was contemplating leaving her marriage. Wallis told her mother and Uncle Saul that she wanted a divorce. They were horrified, fearing it would bring disgrace upon the family.
Wallis is furious because she thinks Uncle Saul is a complete hypocrite. He's not married, he has a string of mistresses, but he says to her, if she perseveres in her determination to get a divorce, he'll cut her out of his will.
Life was made a little easier when, in 1922, Wynne was posted to Hong Kong. Wallis threw herself into the social life of Washington. But after 2 years, she decided to rejoin Wynne and give her marriage a second chance. In July 1924, Wallis sailed to the Far East on a troop carrier. It was not long, though, before Wynne was drinking heavily again, and the cycle of abuse resumed. Wallis finally left him.
He married twice subsequently, and both second and third wife cited his violence and alcoholism in their petitions for divorce.
She left him, had no resources, no marketable skills at all. I think Wallis's break with Wynne was one of her finest hours.
We are going over now by plane to a mysterious piece of earth, the famous forbidden city of emperors, Peking.
Before returning home, Wallis decided to take a short tour of China. She traveled to Peking and stayed with an old friend, Catherine Bigelow, who was married to a successful banker, Herman Rogers. This domestic arrangement later became a source of base speculation.
It's part of the Wallis myth that she lived in a ménage à trois with Catherine and Herman. She did live with them for a year. It may have been that she ran interference in a marriage that was basically dull. What went on, we will never know.
China may have had its charms, but Wallis was not free to remarry. If she wanted a break with the past, she needed to return to the United States. So, in 1926, she moved to a hotel in Virginia. Wallis had discovered that if she was resident in the state for a year and could prove she had been separated from Wynne for 3 years, a decree of desertion would be granted.
At Warrenton, Virginia, her divorce ended the romance in this courthouse.
Wallis later wrote, "If ideas like divorce are common enough today, they were revolutionary in the early 1920s. But this was a period of change. Women in the United States now had the vote and increased rights under the law. And like Wallis, they could also initiate divorce proceedings. Nevertheless, Wallis noted, "I had to take courage in my hands."
She had to deal with this divorce because she was approaching 30. Wallis thought, I'm never going to be attractive beyond 30, so I'd better do something about remarrying, whatever the cost.
On her trips to New York, Wallis claimed she contemplated getting a job. But with no special training, her options were limited. She wrote, "Department store selling had little appeal for me." Wallis rejected work and set her sights on another marriage.
If you look at the whole story, why she behaved in the way she did, I think it's really easy to see that she was trying to avenge her mother's poverty.
It was Christmas 1926, a year before her divorce was granted, that Wallis met her next husband, Anglo-American Ernest Simpson. Ernest worked for his family's firm, an international shipping business. He was keen to transfer to the company's London office and settle in Britain. Ernest was immediately drawn to Wallis. The couple started dining out and enjoying the best New York had to offer. Wallis realized an opportunity had presented itself that might not be bettered. Ernest impressed her. She, in turn, seduced him.
He was an aesthete who loved art, history, and culture, and so forth. And she was a marvelous listener. So her attention must have been quite flattering, and he must have thought, oh, she's fascinated with what I'm doing.
But there was a problem. Ernest was already married. Ernest, though, moved quickly to obtain a divorce. He then left New York and headed for London, asking Wallis to join him there once he was free to remarry. She agreed, and the couple wed in July 1928 at Chelsea Register Office. Wallis was 32.
I think the relationship between Wallis and Ernest is typical of many marriages where one does the loving and one is loved. I think Ernest loved genuinely, adored Wallis.
Wallis settled to life in London and adapted herself to British ways. One aspect that surprised Wallis was the nation's fascination with its royal family, including the heir apparent, Edward, Prince of Wales. A veteran of the Great War, Edward's peacetime royal duties included multiple tours of the British Empire. His first was to Canada in 1919. But despite appearances, the prince disliked the strict royal protocol by which he was bound.
Edward himself had served at the front, and he had mixed with all classes of people, and it had changed him. He said so. And he wanted to do things differently.
He said things like, I think the days of monarchy are all over. I think my father's a tyrant. He was really projecting a very different picture in his private life, but of course the public didn't know that.
By now, in his mid-30s, the prince was also unmarried. This was a matter for concern, as the future king was required to provide an heir. He was expected to pick a bride from among the ranks of the aristocracy. But unbeknown to his adoring public, the prince had a penchant for married women.
Now, Wallis was one never to lose a useful contact or an address, and while she'd been in Pensacola, she knew a relation of Thelma Furness, who was then the mistress of the Prince of Wales.
Thelma Furness had married into the British aristocracy, becoming a viscountess. She was one of the dollar princesses, the fabulously rich daughters of American industrial billionaires who came to England looking for the one thing they couldn't buy at home, a title. They were made welcome by the land-rich but cash-poor members of the British aristocracy. It was the Prince of Wales's grandfather, Edward VII, who described the dollar princesses as livelier, better educated, and less hampered by etiquette than their English sisters, a sentiment with which his grandson agreed.
Edward loved Americans. He loved their informality, he loved the democracy, he loved the vitality, and he loved the lack of protocol.
Wallis's connection to the American viscountess opened the door to her first meeting with the prince at the start of 1931. Wallis and Ernest had been invited on a hunting weekend at Borough Court, Thelma's country home, at which the Prince of Wales would also be present. A friendship gradually developed. The prince invited the Simpsons to house party weekends at his country residence, Fort Belvedere, in Windsor Great Park. He, in turn, began visiting the Simpsons at their London home. Ernest, like Wallis, was initially flattered by the attention. But in time, relations became strained, and Ernest would absent himself when the prince came to visit. But it wasn't until late 1934, 3 years after they'd first met, that Wallis fully supplanted Thelma in the prince's affections.
The women he met in society, among the royal courtiers, were very deferential, and they always were so conscious that he was superior to them socially. But Wallis didn't care, and she gave her opinions, and he knew he could count on her opinions.
Wallis later described what attracted her to the prince. He was the open sesame to a new and glittering world that excited me as nothing in my life had ever done before. That I, Wallis Warfield of Baltimore, Maryland, could be part of this enchanted world.
I mean, it's the American dream. The hometown girl wins the prince, you know.
In 1935, the prince's father, King George V, celebrated 25 years on the throne. By this time, Prince Edward's relationship with Wallis had crystallized, and she was a familiar face in high society.
Wallis entertained no illusions that people in society liked her for herself. She knew that they were using her as a way of getting to the king.
The closer that Edward became to Wallis, the more alienated he became from his family, including from his brother Albert and his wife Elizabeth, the Duke and Duchess of York.
Edward and Elizabeth were great friends, and I think that she was perhaps even a little bit in love with him. It was Wallis that broke that relationship.
Wallis was also a cause for concern to the authorities. Secret government files revealed that the Metropolitan Police in London was keeping a close watch on Mrs. Simpson. Of the claims made against Wallis, the most damning was an allegation that she was conducting an affair with a car salesman.
He is Guy Marcus Trundle, now living at 18 Bruton Street. Secret meetings are made by appointment when intimate relations take place.
The content of the secret files reflected the establishment view that Wallis was a most unsuitable companion for a future king.
Well, the only evidence we have is in fact Guy Marcus Trundle himself, because he is mentioned in this report by Special Branch as saying he was having an affair with her, but no other evidence is offered.
If there is one thing that King George has taught, it is the art of the leader who is also a brother to his followers.
King George V died in January 1936. The Prince of Wales was proclaimed King Edward VIII.
God save the King.
The relationship between the old king and his heir had deteriorated in the years before his death. George despaired of his eldest son's affairs with married women. Not long before he died, he said, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months." He had made no secret of his preference for his second son, Albert, Duke of York, a dependable and conservative family man. But the rules of royal succession meant he could not stop Edward becoming king. Regardless, the new monarch was still popular with his public. His government ministers, however, were less enthusiastic. It was quickly apparent that Edward disliked many of his constitutional duties. Similarly, the establishment disliked its lack of control over the king.
They had supported George V, they had enjoyed his ear, they had had power, they had had influence through him. Now they didn't.
The continuing relationship between monarch and divorcee was also a cause of concern. Rumors surrounded the American, including one of another affair. this time between Wallis and the German ambassador to Britain, Joachim von Ribbentrop. Ribbentrop was a familiar face in London. Prior to his appointment as ambassador in 1936, he had served as Hitler's chief advisor on foreign affairs. He mixed in elite social circles, attending receptions hosted by the cream of London society. This is where he encountered Wallis. Wallis may have flirted with Ribbentrop, and he may have thought her worth seducing as a means for getting closer to the king. But claims of an affair have never been proved.
I think the allegation that Wallis had an affair with Ribbentrop, or the other allegation that she had an affair with a car salesman, are an indication of the black picture that was painted of her.
By spring 1936, Wallis and Ernest's marriage was in serious trouble. Under some pressure from the king, they agreed to divorce. Then in May, the king settled a considerable sum of money on Wallis, enabling her to acquire and furnish a house of her own.
So it was very reassuring for Wallis to have this trust fund settled on her. She still didn't think that when the time came, he would actually marry her.
Today, the American press is filled with rumors of royal romance.
In August, the king set sail for a holiday, cruising the Mediterranean. Wallis joined him aboard the Nylon. The cruise attracted considerable attention in the foreign press, especially the United States.
King Edward and Mrs. Simpson have been pictured together on many occasions. And in this topsy-turvy world, it may be time for an American woman to marry a British king.
By tacit agreement, the British press remained silent about the affair. This made it all the more shocking for Wallis when she discovered the amount of coverage given to the holiday in the American press. On the 16th of September 1936, she wrote to the king, saying they should end their relationship.
I think Wallis really wanted to give up any idea of marriage to Edward. She said, "You and I will only create disaster together. I really think I have to go away."
But the king would not let Wallis go. Edward wanted Wallis by his side, even if others disapproved.
When Edward and Wallis are in Balmoral and the Duke and Duchess of York arrive, Wallis walks up to the Duchess of York and to say welcome and to greet her. And the Duchess of York walks straight past her, snubs her, and in a way that was incredibly rude.
In October 1936, British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin cautioned the king against Wallis proceeding with her divorce. Edward replied he could not live without Wallis and intended to marry her. Later that month, Wallis was granted a decree nisi, paving the way for her divorce from Ernest to be made final the following year. Edward's intentions were clear. But as king, he was head of the Church of England, an institution that opposed remarriage after divorce. As a result, marriage to Wallis would not be possible.
Some members of the government had indicated they wouldn't mind if Edward had her as his mistress, but Edward wanted to marry Wallis.
If Wallis was a source of disquiet in establishment circles, the king's popularity was becoming a thorn in the side of government. In November 1936, Edward made a trip to South Wales and visited a town where the local steelworks had closed and 3/4 of the men were unemployed. It was a scene of desolation. The king was disturbed by what he saw and declared something must be done.
Because it was filmed by the newsreels, his visit to South Wales was seen in cinemas all over Britain the following week. And this was horrifying for the government because it highlighted the fact that something must be done that was not being done for the poor.
A new king of Britain and the Empire comes to join with his people in solemn remembrance.
Edward's response to the plight of the unemployed was more that of feudal landlord than democratic figurehead. His government considered the remarks as being totally out of line. Something indeed needed to be done, but about the king. And unbeknown to Wallis, she would provide the lever.
The head of the civil service, the top people of establishment, came up initially with a letter that Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, would write to Edward, advising him to send Wallis away, and that if he didn't, then it would cause the breakdown, the fall of the government and a national crisis.
When Edward read the letter, he was horrified.
He saw it as a betrayal. He was very hurt, and I think it came to him then clearly that, in fact, he couldn't count on the decency of the old gang, and they were, in fact, at war with him.
The king reacted to the letter, telling his Prime Minister if he and the government objected to his marrying Wallis, he was prepared to go. Edward did, however, suggest a solution. He proposed a morganatic marriage, whereby he would remain king with Wallis as his wife, but not his queen.
Baldwin came back to Edward and said government could not accept the plan for a morganatic marriage because of the uncompromising stand of the Dominions.
None of them could possibly countenance a divorced queen. It wasn't that she was American, it wasn't anything else other than the fact that she had 2 living husbands. They were not prepared to accept her.
By early December, all options exhausted, the king was told either he must end his relationship with Mrs. Simpson or abdicate. He was also told the British press was about to break its silence about their relationship. Almost immediately, Wallis began receiving anonymous letters containing threats of violence. She was forced to leave her London home.
Once the story broke, she was receiving threatening letters, including one that said something to the effect of, "As a patriot, I'm going to have to kill you." This kind of thing was obviously very disturbing.
Everybody says you've got to get out of the country because they cannot guarantee her life.
On the 3rd of December, Wallis fled from England, travelling to the south of France to stay with her old friends, Catherine and Herman Rogers.
There's this hair-raising journey where she's followed by the paparazzi and she has to hide and duck and cover her head with a blanket. It's really a terrifying time for her.
Can a king separate his personal life from his public duty? Should he be able to choose his own personal friends, his private interests, and his own wife? Or must he, night and day, in all things, in all ways, be the servant of his crown?
The king's affair was now in the public domain. Press and public were divided.
The majority of ordinary people were very understanding. They liked Edward so much anyway, and there was a sense of, if he wanted Wallis, well, fine. Let him have what he wants. We love him.
Now in France, pressure was being applied to Wallis by government figures to renounce the king. Wallis expressed her willingness to withdraw if such action would solve the problem. But Edward would not be moved, nor would his government relent. 8 days after Wallis's departure, on the 11th of December 1936, the king announced his decision.
You all know the reasons have impelled me to renounce the throne. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love.
Edward's reluctant younger brother, Albert, became king. In homage to his father, he was styled George VI. This was a situation without precedent. A new king proclaimed while the former monarch was still alive. Uncertain of how to proceed, Edward, now to be called the Duke of Windsor, agreed to go into exile for a minimum of 2 years. He left, believing his public popularity was such that once the dust had settled, he would return to England and to public life. He travelled to Austria, where he remained hidden from public view. Edward could not yet join Wallis, as her divorce would be imperilled if they were to meet before it was finalised. In March 1937, Wallis moved to the Château de Conde in northwest France, the setting for the wedding. Wallis kept firmly out of sight. The object of continuing hate mail and death threats, she wrote, "Nothing shook me so much or hurt me more than the discovery of the scorn, even hatred, that many felt for me." If she had ever pictured a life with Edward, this was not it.
She said, "I felt like an animal caught in a trap." And she was, because there were no decisions left for her to make. She just had to follow through on the course of events that had now been written for her. And I think that must have been appalling.
Wallis's divorce was decreed absolute in May 1937. It was now safe for Edward to join her. The couple were married on the 3rd of June. He was approaching 43, she 41. It was a day of mixed emotions. The new king forbade members of the royal family from attending the wedding. And more offensive to the Duke, the king confirmed that Wallis would be titled Duchess of Windsor, but denied the usual style of Her Royal Highness.
Edward was absolutely furious about that, and really that defined the rest of his life. It became corrosive, the bitterness, trying to establish that his wife really should have been HRH.
We're talking about a royal family, and these things, which may seem unimportant to us, are crucial to them. And to Edward, it meant that they wouldn't recognise his wife as really his wife.
After an extended honeymoon, the Duke and Duchess took a small apartment in the Hotel Meurice in Paris. Abandoned by his country's government and with no one to advise him, the Duke was trying to find a role for himself. His new friend, Franco-American industrialist Charles Beddoes, a man keen to promote his own business interests, suggested the Duke visit Germany to study the working conditions of the country's labor force. But this was just 2 years after Germany's Nazi government had passed the anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws of 1935, and relations between Britain and Germany were under strain. The idea, however, appealed to the German-speaking Duke. He agreed to his government's request not to deliver any formal speeches, but his naivety about his own self-importance led him to believe his visit might help improve relations between Britain and the Nazi regime.
How foolish, how stupid, how weak. Of course they should have known, 2 years after the Nuremberg laws had been passed, what the situation was in Germany.
The Windsors arrived in Berlin in October 1937. They were greeted by a number of Nazi leaders who accompanied them throughout their visit. Wallis relished being treated as royalty, even being addressed as Her Royal Highness. She appeared delighted at being in the company of the Führer, but she was excluded from a private meeting between Hitler and the Duke, and, allegedly furious at the snub, later wrote, "I decided Hitler did not care for women." The trip undoubtedly damaged the Duke and Duchess and gave rise to the notion that they were incipient Nazis.
I suppose the most sympathetic thing you could say about Edward's attitude to Hitler and co., which, let's face it, was pure appeasement. He had gone through the First World War, and a lot of people really felt anything was worth rather than another war.
Back in France, a major preoccupation for the Duke was his right to return to Britain. He was alarmed to discover that his 2-year exile might be extended indefinitely. Without a job to distract him, it was left to Wallis to, as she described, fill for him this perhaps unfillable gap.
To the quiet rest of England's countryside, we welcome back the Duke and Duchess of Windsor.
It was not until September 1939 that the Duke visited Britain. He'd been called home to discuss how he might serve his country, now at war with Germany.
He must be glad to see England again.
Initially offered a choice between a civilian job back in Britain and a military liaison job in France, the Duke's option to choose was withdrawn, and he was ordered back to Paris.
George VI and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, were so mean to Edward and Wallis and would not allow them back into Britain to do a useful job and to have a place in Edward's country.
Back in Paris, the Duke took up his military post. During the long months prior to Germany's invasion of France, the so-called Phony War, the Duchess worked for the French Red Cross. She described herself as more useful than she had ever been in her life.
Inside the Maginot Line, the French army sits in fancied security. A strange interlude on the Western Front encourages this delusion.
In June 1940, France fell. The Windsors headed south. Wallis described the roads as crowded as never before. All of Western Europe was on the run. The Duke and Duchess fled to Spain, where they received instructions to return to Britain. This was the chance for the Duke to re-establish himself at home. But he blew it by demanding his wife be accorded equality with the wives of his brothers as an HRH.
In the event, Wallis learnt to live with that, but it was Edward who was so aggrieved on his wife's behalf. Effectively, this was what created them permanent exiles.
Edward's attitude sealed his fate. With the King's consent, the British government appointed the Duke as governor of the Bahamas, thereby putting him out of the way. The Windsors travelled to Portugal before sailing across the Atlantic. Recently released German documents reveal the Nazi regime had hoped to intercept the Duke and Duchess before they left Europe.
The fact that the Germans were so anxious to contact him when he was in Portugal is very suspicious. You see, I don't believe he was a very intelligent man. And so it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that he might have betrayed his brother, although many people wouldn't agree with me.
I, Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David Duke of Windsor, do swear that I will well and truly serve His Majesty King George, so help me God.
The Duke and Duchess had set sail for the Bahamas before the plot could be executed. Wallis later wrote that she and the Duke had gladly accepted the posting. In reality, the couple knew they had been banished. Whatever their misgivings, Wallis turned her hand as best she could to the role of governor's wife.
As president of the Bahamas Red Cross, the Duchess presents the contestants with personal tokens of appreciation.
This conduct, though, was not enough to stop their every move being monitored by both British and American security forces.
Reports, of course, had come to the United States that the Duke and Duchess had potential Nazi sympathies, and that there was some concern over, what perhaps they were doing. You get a couple rumors here, you get a couple clippings there. Among those were some rumors about Wallis Simpson, including that she had passed on intelligence to the Germans through von Ribbentrop. Lots of people thought that they were Nazi sympathizers. But based on the FBI's investigation, there's certainly no evidence that they were pursuing that sort of thing in the United States.
Edward may have felt a kinship with Germany, but he was not pro-war. Whatever the evidence, however, the allegations that the Windsors were Nazi sympathizers feeding secrets to the German war machine remain active on both sides of the Atlantic.
When the official government documents relating to the abdication were released in 2003, I was the historical advisor at the National Archives, and I had to speak to the press. And it was quite extraordinary that when the press turned up, they were all just waiting for what they expected, and there's no reason why they shouldn't expect it. On the basis of the story they'd been told, the story they believed, these records were going to be full of evidence about Edward and Wallis being Nazi agents, and there was nothing. They were so disappointed.
At the end of the war, the Duke's governorship came to an end. He and the Duchess left the Bahamas in May 1945.
The Bahamas was supposed to be the low point in their career, and yet it proved a very strong bonding experience for both of them. So their Elba, which they complained about bitterly, turned out to be one of the most positive experiences of their lives.
Edward hoped for another posting, this time to Canada. This would give him the status he still craved. It would also allow him to spend more time on his ranch in Alberta, a property he'd bought in 1919. But however warmly the Duke and Duchess had been greeted on their visits to Canada, it was quickly apparent nobody wanted a discredited king as viceroy, let alone his twice-divorced wife as consort. Back in Britain, the post-war Labour government dismissed any idea of giving the Duke a job. Neither did King George want his elder brother back on British soil. Instead, the Duke and Duchess returned to France. He was 50, she 49.
In the gardens of Edenham Lodge, country home of the Earl of Dudley, the Duke and Duchess gave us these charming informal pictures.
Their first post-war trip to Britain was in October 1946. By now, the void in the lives of the Duke and Duchess was glaringly apparent. With no place to call home, the couple lived a restless existence, moving between rented and borrowed houses in France and the United States.
On holiday in sunny Italy, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor.
They traveled constantly, attracting attention wherever they went. But behind the smiles lay frustration and resentment. Wallis was said to be nearly driven mad trying to find ways of amusing the Duke.
I think that Wallis and Edward's post-war life was horribly empty, shallow and superficial.
The shadow of death hovered over King George of England as these last pictures were made.
In February 1952, the Duke's brother, King George VI, died from lung cancer. He was 56.
His coffin on a gun carriage is drawn by enlisted men of the Royal Navy and is followed by the carriage bearing Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and Princess Margaret. They in turn are followed by the young Duke of Kent, the Duke of Windsor, the Duke of Gloucester, and the Queen's husband, the Duke of Edinburgh.
The Duke of Windsor attended the funeral without the Duchess. Now his niece Elizabeth was Queen, the Duke hoped a return to England might be possible. The new reign, however, did not make life easier for him. Keeping the former monarch out of the country was considered to be in the public interest. Edward realized there was no future for him in Britain. By now in their late 50s, the Duke and Duchess finally set up permanent residence in Paris.
London. At Marlborough House, the late Queen Mary spent her widowhood.
It was not until 1967 that the couple were thrown an olive branch by the royal family. They were both invited by the Queen to attend the unveiling of a plaque commemorating the life of the Duke's mother, Queen Mary. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was seen to publicly acknowledge the Duke and Duchess. Later, the Queen was caught on camera chatting briefly with the couple.
The differences that arose out of the events of 30 years ago melted away at this memorial to Queen Mary.
Edward Heath, the Conservative Prime Minister, said, "Many of us have felt that the Duke of Windsor has not been treated well. Surely now, when he's in the evening of his life, something should be done to put this right."
In reality, nothing changed. And 5 years later, in 1972, the Duke died. His body was flown back to England. 60,000 people filed past his coffin. The royal family all attended the Duke's funeral, together with the Duchess. After the funeral, Wallis returned to Paris and for a short period continued to attend events. But by the mid-70s, her health was in sharp decline. Physically frail and suffering increasingly from dementia, she was confined within the walls of her Paris home. It was a sad and lonely demise. Finally, in April 1986, Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, died. She was almost 90. Her reputation as a figure of hate remained unchanged.
The story was so cleverly spun about Wallis being a cunning schemer. All she wanted to do was to be queen, that it worked. And it has become the, if you like, it's become the truth.
Wallis, driven by a need for material security and then exposed to a world beyond her wildest imaginings, applied her man-charming talents and seduced a future king. But then lost control. The greatest romance of the 20th century turned out to be a trap from which Wallis knew she could not escape.
She attracted one of the most handsome, charming and powerful men in the world, but au fond, this was a really damaged man who probably did not want to be king and was looking for somebody like Wallis, and Wallis provided him with an escape. So of course we remember her as a woman who diverted the course of history.